Exact same thoughts. Okay, so that's ready. Welcome to the March 2018 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission, which is also known as Commissioner Clyburn's 29th birthday. Happy birthday, Commissioner Clyburn. Certainly hope this iteration is as fun as some of the previous ones have been.
It already is, thank you.
Madam Secretary, sorry to take away from your thunder, but please would you announce our agenda for the day?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 6 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order that would clarify and modify the procedures for NHPA and NEPA review of wireless infrastructure deployment. Second, you will consider a second further notice of proposed rulemaking to address the problem of unwanted calls to reassign numbers. Third, you will consider a notice of inquiry examining location-based routing of wireless 911 calls to ensure that calls are routed to the proper 911 call center. Fourth, you will consider a sixth further notice of proposed rulemaking to stimulate use of and investment in the 4.9 gigahertz band. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes to streamline the reauthorization process for television satellite stations that are assigned or transferred in combination with a previously approved parent station. Sixth, you will consider a second report and order that would remove the personal use restriction for provider-specific consumer signal boosters, and a second further notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks comment on ways to further expand access to consumer signal boosters. This is your agenda for today. The first item, entitled Accelerating Wireless Broadband Deployment by Removing Barriers to Infrastructure Investment, will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Don Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Stockdale, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
I am pleased to present to you an order that would significantly streamline the historic preservation and environmental reviews required for proposed wireless infrastructure deployments. I'm joined at the table today by Suzanne Tétrault, Garnet Hanley, and Darrell Pay. In addition to the WTB staff at the table, I want to thank the many other staff from our Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division who put an enormous amount of work into this item, as did staff from OGC, ONAP, and other bureaus who are listed on the slide. Darrell will now present the item.
Thank you, Don. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We present to you today an order that would reduce substantially unnecessary regulatory impediments to the deployment of wireless broadband networks. The second report in order before you would define small wireless facilities and find that the deployment of such facilities by non-federal entities, including private parties, does not constitute a federal undertaking within the meaning of the National Historic Preservation Act or a major federal action under the National Environmental Policy Act. As a result, the deployments would not be subject to those particular federal historic preservation and environmental reviews. For the larger deployments that are still required to undergo those federal reviews, the draft order would improve the Commission's process for engaging tribal nations and Native Hawaiian organizations in historic preservation review for construction projects outside of tribal lands. First, it would adopt measures to ensure the tribes are provided with the information necessary to comment on these projects before notification of the project is considered complete. The order would adjust the procedures for cases in which tribal nations do not respond after having been given the opportunity to review submissions. In addition, the draft order would clarify that applicants are not required to pay upfront fees when providing tribal nations with an opportunity to comment on proposed facilities deployments, and in cases where additional consultant services are necessary to identify and evaluate historic properties, would clarify the obligation of the applicant to hire a qualified consultant. Finally, the draft order would amend the Commission's rules to provide that applicants would no longer be required to prepare environmental assessments solely because a proposed project is located in a floodplain, so long as the project is constructed at least 1 foot above the base floodplain elevation. The second reporting order would also establish timelines for Commission review of environmental assessments. Collectively, these measures would reduce or eliminate unnecessary costs of deploying wireless infrastructure, thereby encouraging new wireless broadband service deployments. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pei, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Next generation commercial wireless services deserve next generation wireless infrastructure policies. On that, we can agree. But our nation's infrastructure policies must be aligned with existing congressional mandates and the needs of local communities. Congress, through the Communications Act, directed the Federal Communications Commission to develop spectrum management and infrastructure deployment policies that promote competition, enable economic opportunities, and ensure that new and innovative technologies are readily accessible to all Americans. The National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act require every federal agency, including the FCC, to also consider the extent to which any action and undertaking that their policies enable could impact the natural environment and historic aspects of communities. To achieve the right balance of these statutory objectives, the Commission is expected to approach its infrastructure proceedings collaboratively and include the perspectives of as many communities as possible. When the Commission has followed this approach, I have consistently voted to approve those decisions. I supported the orders leading up to the 3 commercial wireless spectrum auctions because they established a competitive foundation where all communities stood to benefit from the launch of next-generation 5G services. I approved the bulk of the decisions made in the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding because they allowed a diverse group of companies to contribute to the deployment of 5G services in both rural and urban areas using spectrum bands above 24 gigahertz. And I voted in favor of several orders to streamline the review and approval of communications towers and other infrastructure equipment. It is true that at times I have pushed for edits and various approaches to infrastructure challenges that would enable industry to address the concerns of rural and other areas. Notably, it was this approach that I took back in 2014 with the order that streamlined review of the co-location of towers to 60 days. But I would not agree to vote for that 60-day deadline until industry associations agreed to work with resource-constrained localities to find ways to more quickly review those applications. As I began my review of today's draft order, as I often like to say, I started from the 50-yard line. And after hearing the concerns of tribal nations and local government, I began discussing possible proposals that might address those concerns with Commissioner Carr's office. But after many open and direct exchanges, my major concerns could not be addressed, and following a full, comprehensive review of the record that included multiple conversations with numerous stakeholders about the concerns raised by tribal nations, environmental protection advocates, and local government representatives, I concluded that the best course for all parties was to delay today's vote. At this juncture, the potential adverse impact of these proposed rules on tribal nations, historic sites, and the natural environment were severe and had yet to be fully addressed. Unfortunately, my request to delay the vote was rejected. But let me clearly reiterate for the record, I strongly support efforts to facilitate the deployment of 5G next-generation wireless services. Each of us has seen how brilliant minds in the fields of technology, software, communications, how they are working together to make a difference in so many ways, such as healthcare, education, energy efficiency, and manufacturing. There is no question we will see phenomenal benefits when and if 5G is fully deployed in all communities. And we have already shown the rest of the world that we can still lead in the deployment of 4G LTE services while complying with federal statutes designed to protect the environment and historic sites. So for me, it is clear and the evidence is convincing that winning the 5G race need not come at the expense of those important statutory goals. Because I believe this order sacrifices these goals, I am forced to dissent from this order. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank the Chair. I wholeheartedly support the item before the Commission, and I commend the Chairman and Commissioner Carr for bringing it forward. In essence, it addresses two main barriers to wireless tower and antenna siting: unnecessary delays and outrageous fees. I've talked about and sought needed reforms in this area for years. In reality, we are finally completing an issue initiated by former Chairman Wheeler in a bipartisan fashion during the previous Commission. In doing so, our efforts will help facilitate the deployment of wireless broadband throughout our nation, including 5G wireless services, which is critical to preserving America's leadership position, something that I am committed to making sure happens. We're also setting the stage for future actions, hopefully later this summer, against similar state and local governmental barriers. Well, the first part of this item approaches the barrier problem differently than I might have done. It gets to the same welcome outcome. The item declares that wireless small cells do not generate a federal undertaking for purposes of NHPA or a major federal action for purposes of NEPA. This decision is meticulously explained and justified in the text that should more than satisfy judicial review. In sum, we are interpreting, as is our right and obligation, certain Commission functions to be below a threshold necessary for the statutory requirements of either law to come into play. To find otherwise, as some have tried to do in the record, is to interpret those two statutes in a way that would treat the agency's geographic licensing as a trigger for unnecessary action and review, far exceeding Congress's original intent. As the item states, the Commission's issuance of a geographic license does not involve the Commission in any decisions regarding the deployment of actual facilities. Such extreme readings of the law would effectively make any Commission action a federal undertaking under NHPA and eliminate the major before federal action in NEPA. This would improperly allow environmental and historic preservation concerns to be placed above any other consideration, which is illogical and would effectively grant a de facto veto over any activity to those that pose as defenders of these laws. The second portion of the item is no less important, as it makes abundantly clear that no communications provider is required to pay the outrageous fees or hire hand-picked individuals demanded by select tribes as part of the Section 106 reviews. The current procedures, which I've repeatedly criticized, have turned into a perverse scheme whereby some tribes have sought money and consulting roles for areas that their ancestors never traveled as a means to raise revenues and address tribal unemployment, a jobs program, if you will. And the problem is only getting worse, such practices are turning tower and antenna siting into the latest cash cow. I've cited many data points to highlight the issue of extraordinarily high fees in previous speeches, but the examples just keep coming. The record contains accounts of AT&T paying a total of $13,525 in fees to 36 tribes for the co-location of one antenna at a Minnesota hotel. Another provider paid almost $20,000 in tribal review cost to cover fees from 38 tribes for a tower in Wyoming. The same applicant built a similar tower in the same town a year earlier, and the fees were over $6,000 cheaper. Sprint paid $12,200 in total fees to 25 tribes for a small cell outside a steel factory in Indiana, which was determined to have no effect on tribal historic properties. Further, some tribes are receiving payment but then never respond as to whether there's actual concern, causing needless delays. More generally, AT&T reports that tribal fees have increased by 1,400% in the Northeast and 25,000% in the Southeast in the last 7 years. And Sprint paid $23 million in review fees in the past 2 years, which could have provided 657 additional sites that would increase coverage and capacity for consumers. This is not sustainable if we want to actually get broadband to all Americans, including those on tribal lands. In fairness, I would have gone a little further in clarifying that providers don't need to pay the fees or contract for consultative functions with tribes. As currently structured, the language states that providers don't have to do these things, but we all know that some tribes will still try to force the permissive activity on providers anyway. This is a little too loosey-goosey for me. Instead, I would have preferred that such practices be prohibited. Additionally, the item should have made clear that applicants are only required to provide additional information or hire a professional contractor without a showing, even if provided confidentiality, that there's actual historic property of religious and cultural significance in the project's area. While there is a complaint process after the fact, requiring proof up front may decrease the chances that more information and professional contractors could be requested for every potential siting project and reduce commission workload and application delays. On that note, I do have a couple small issues with the item. Specifically, I want to be on record restating my long-standing views that Section 1 of the Communications Act and Section 706 of the Telecom Act do not provide the Commission with authority to do anything. The item cites these provisions in a paragraph with questionable value, but I want to thank Commissioner Carr for clarifying the language that these sections do not confer any authority. I also wish that we could have done some more on providing relief for macro towers in the first portion of the item. Instead, it states that the issue remains pending and it may be the subject of future items. But I'm concerned that there's only so much appetite to engage on the issue of wireless siting. Fatigue generally starts to set in, especially as the work gets more contentious and the opposition much louder. I intend to make sure that won't be the case here and that we consider further historic preservation and other relief for macro towers as soon as possible. For too long, we've allowed a small subset of tribes acting in bad faith to unnecessarily slow communications network build-out. This brings a bad name to the rest of the American tribes that really try to do good faith effort to work with wireless providers on behalf of consumers. However, the need to address barriers to the placement of wireless towers and antenna for expanded coverage and the initiation of new services is not new. It has been a long-standing problem, and every time an action is proposed, we get calls for more collaboration and cooperation by the very same parties that have been dragging their heels. The private sector has tried collaboration and cooperation until they're blue in the face. The Commission has also tried collaboration and cooperation with similar results. The consultations and meetings have occurred as detailed in the order and the record. It's time to move past the talking stage. I'm pleased that we're doing just that today. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
It's great to see the Fcc moving forward today. The race to 5G is on. Winning this race will mean more broadband for more Americans. It'll mean new opportunities for unserved and underserved communities. It'll mean unleashing the next wave of American innovation. In the U.S., the private sector is doing its part. Entrepreneurs are hard at work developing cutting-edge technologies that will run over these 5G networks. Everything from smart city applications to autonomous cars, from connected homes and virtual reality to precision agricultural and remote surgery. And wireless providers are poised to invest $275 billion necessary to deploy these 5G networks. Investments that can create 3 million new jobs and add $500 billion to the GDP. But there's a problem. We will not win this race. Consumers in the U.S. will not realize these benefits if we don't do our part at the FCC. That means moving aggressively to free up new spectrum bands, as we've been doing with our auction of 5G spectrum later this year, And that means moving with equal dispatch to ensure that providers can deploy the infrastructure that's actually necessary for consumers to use all that spectrum. Our regulatory counterparts around the world are well aware that the United States led the world in 4G. They're eager to leapfrog us to 5G. A central part of their 5G agenda is to update their infrastructure deployment rules. That's why today's vote is so important. It's a chance for the FCC to demonstrate our commitment to seeing the United States and American consumers win the race to 5G. The focus on infrastructure reform only makes sense. After all, 5G networks will look very different from the networks of today. Those tall 100-foot towers that many people associate with current generation of technologies will be supplemented by new small cell facilities no larger than the size of a backpack. Going forward, upwards of 80% of new deployments are expected to be these new small cells. But while technology is advancing, our infrastructure deployment rules have been stuck in the analog era. Our outdated approach to NEPA and NEHIPA, for instance, is costing Americans tens of millions of dollars per year and delaying the rollout of new services. One provider spent over $23 million on the HIPAA review over the last 2 years, money, as we've heard, that could have been used to deploy 657 new cell sites to expand coverage or add new capacity. In 2017, all told, providers spent $36 million on the HIPAA and NEPA reviews. And the problem is getting worse, not better. Without reform, the projected costs for these reviews will spike to $241 million this year as 5G deployments ramp up. So what is the public getting for these millions in fees that they're ultimately responsible for? The record shows that in all but 0.33% of cases, the reviews have not resulted in any changes to planned deployments. And that percentage presumably skews towards those larger towers that will continue to undergo NEPA and NEHIPA review. The disproportionate fees are the product of a broken and outdated system. When one provider deployed 23 cells at Energy Stadium in Houston ahead of last year's Super Bowl, Section 106 fees exceeded $173,000. And remember, that was for placing cells on previously disturbed ground, in a parking lot, and on an NFL stadium, neither of which, by the way, required historic or environmental review when they were constructed. Unfortunately, this example is not a one-off. Today, out of the total cost of deploying small cells, the equipment, the labor, the permitting, nearly 30% is consumed by our outdated NEPA and NEHIPA procedures. This threatens to hold us back in the race to 5G or limit the business case to just densely populated or affluent areas. That's not success. With today's order, we can flip the business case for thousands of communities. Here's how. First, we'll exempt small cells from NEPA and NEHIPA review given their much different size and footprint than those large towers. This will extend the same regulatory treatment to those deployments that the Commission has always applied to other types of infrastructure, including Wi-Fi routers and consumer signal boosters. Moreover, our decision will not greenlight any particular deployment. They will continue to undergo appropriate state and local review. Second, the order will streamline the federal procedures that will continue to apply to those larger deployments, including by putting the FCC itself on a shot clock. In light of all this, our approach benefited tremendously from extensive engagement with tribal nations, consultations that spanned 3 years. Indeed, in 2014, when the prior Commission took steps to update our infrastructure rules, it did not engage in any similar outreach or engagement. In this case, FCC leadership and staff participated in consultations in at least 9 different states, including Oklahoma, South Dakota, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. FCC officials attended tribal conferences, hosted tribal representatives here at the FCC, and conducted dozens and dozens of meetings and conference calls concerning the subject matter we're voting on today. These consultations resulted in significant outcomes. For instance, the order maintains the current approach to small cell and other deployments on tribal lands, given the feedback we received. It adopts reforms that will give tribes more information earlier in the process for those reviews that go through NHIPAA procedures. It rejects requests to limit the geographic area where tribes can express interest and participate in the process. It also expressly recognizes the circumstances in which tribes can be paid fees for their consulting services. And in those cases, the order rejects calls that we limit or otherwise regulate the fees that tribes can charge. We've been able to reach a better outcome based on the extensive consultation process, and we're maintaining and focusing federal review on those deployments that are more likely to raise concerns. By taking these steps today, we will deliver immediate results to communities around the country. A recent Accenture study determined that excluding small cells from federal review will result in at least $1.56 billion in savings. That capital can be used to deploy in excess of 55,000 new cell sites and create more than 17,000 jobs. That's billions of dollars for more broadband, and not one penny comes from new taxes or fees on consumers. 1.6 billion, 57,000 new small cells, 17,000 jobs. Those are big numbers. They're tough to wrap your head around in the abstract. So to get some perspective, I took a road trip through the Shenandoah Valley 2 weeks ago. At a roundtable, I spoke with residents and small business owners who discussed the lack of high-speed broadband in their rural communities. They talked about sending their kids to school early or letting them stay there late just so they could work off of a good internet connection. Infrastructure reform can help close this gap. One local provider, Shentel, noted that streamlining the federal review process will free up enough capital for the company to deploy 13 new cell sites in the Shenandoah Valley. That could be the first high-speed broadband for those families or the first competitive option that they might have. I've seen the same opportunity in urban areas. Last week I drove up to Baltimore. I visited a neighborhood in East Baltimore called CARE, which stands for Caring Active Restoring Efforts. There are still some boarded up row houses in CARE, but if you keep your eyes open, you can see new opportunity on the rise. If you really know what you're looking for, you can see it in the dozens of small cells that have been deployed throughout the neighborhood. 2 providers noticed that the macro cell serving CARE was running out of capacity because for families in the area, their wireless connection provides their only high-speed internet access in many cases. So to provide broadband capacity, those carriers attached a series of small cells to streetlights running down the main avenue. We can replicate these results in even more communities. We can get more broadband to more Americans if we reform our infrastructure rules. So in the weeks since we released our draft decision, it's been heartening to see the diverse coalition that supports this effort, that is serious about seeing the United States win the race to 5G. Tech advocates like the App Association, Encompass, CCI, and CTIA, smaller broadband providers at CCA and CTIA, voices from underserved communities like the League of United Latin American Citizens, the LGBT Tech Coalition, National Grange, job creators like the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council and the U.S. Chamber, and other organizations including the Progressive Policy Institute, Citizens Against Government Waste, Freedom Works, and the U.S. Small Business Administration. These are not groups that find common ground on all telecom issues, but it's a broad coalition that understands the need to get our regulatory structures 5G ready. Since the chairman asked me to take the lead on the FCC's wireless infrastructure proceeding 5 months ago, I've welcomed the chance to work with all stakeholders in developing our approach. This decision today is the product of many, many hours of work from Commission staff, especially the talented team in our Wireless Telecommunications Bureau that presented the item. I want to recognize and thank you all for your work, in addition to the significant contributions from the Office of General Counsel and the Office of Native Affairs and Policies and the other bureaus that were put up on the slide earlier. I know you all have spent years on these issues, and the order before us has greatly benefited from your expertise. It has my full support. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
A wireless revolution is underway. The shift to fifth generation or 5G wireless is much more than incremental change. It will foster a whole new world of mobile connectivity, and no matter who you are or where you live, you will need access to have a fair shot at 21st century success. But let's be frank. It is not a sure thing that the United States will lead the world in 5G wireless. In fact, the available evidence is that we're falling behind. If we want to lead in 5G, we unconditionally need a new spectrum auction this year. South Korea, Germany, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Romania are now leading the way with definitive plans for wireless auctions in 2018. We do not do that here. If we want to lead in 5G, we need policies to encourage deep fiber investments. Our wireless facilities will need to be connected to millions of miles of fiber, requiring creative thinking about everything from permitting to securing access to rights of way. We do not do that here. If we want to lead in 5G, we need serious policies to address our equipment supply chain challenges. That means developing a real plan rather than relying on the opaque decisions issued from behind the closed doors of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. We do not do that here. If we want to lead in 5G, we need to modernize our approach to wireless infrastructure. We need to streamline the process for the deployment of small cells because over the next 8 years, we will require as many as 800,000 of them. That's daunting. At the same time, we need to modernize our approach to larger wireless facilities, and that's daunting too. A solution to this infrastructure challenge is long overdue, and while today's decision purports to be one, it misses the mark. It runs roughshod over the rights of our tribal communities, and it gives short shrift to our most basic environmental and historic preservation values. Moreover, too much of its policy and legal analysis is lacking the heft necessary to support the result. What we have here will not help us lead or even be 5G ready. Our work deserves a delay so we can fix these deficiencies and move forward together. Because we do not take the time to remedy these problems when we can and should, I dissent. This decision takes 3 main actions. All 3 have problems. First, this decision cuts tribal authorities from their rightful role reviewing wireless facilities. While I believe this process would benefit from modernization, in this decision we fail to fulfill our federal trust relationship with respect to 5G deployment. We have long-standing duties to consult with tribes before implementing any regulation or policy that will significantly or uniquely affect tribal governments, their land, or their resources. This responsibility is memorialized in the FCC's policy statement on establishing a government-to-government relationship with Indian tribes. But we do not honor it here. While the decision lists every minor contact this agency has had with tribal authorities, remember this: not a single tribe has expressed support for today's action. Second, this decision removes small cells from the purview of the National Historic Preservation Act and National Environmental Policy Act. This approach has both policy and legal frailties. With respect to policy, it's no secret that rural and low-income communities trail our urban areas when it comes to broadband access. But not a single comment in this proceeding has suggested that the root of that problem is our historic or environmental review process. Rather, it's simple economics. These communities are difficult to serve because they do not provide the return on investment that supports build-out. We don't tackle that hard truth here, or seek commitments to ensure deployment in hard-to-serve areas, but we should. Can I ask why we're removing someone who's behaving from the audience right here, right now?
She wants to talk about the environmental effects, saying that wireless radiation causes cancer and neurological problems.
No. I appreciate it. No. I'm just saying there's someone who's sitting here quietly and listening. I would just ask that we not remove people from the room who are quietly listening.
What happened to the First Amendment? Ramazzini Institute shows non-thermal.
In addition,
from cell towers.
our interpretation of the National Historic Preservation Act is flawed and likely to have messy consequences for future wireless deployment. The law defines an undertaking as a project, activity, or program funded in whole or part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency, including those carried out by or on behalf of a federal agency, those carried out with federal financial assistance, and those requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. Okay, that's complicated, so let's count them. There are 3 elements to that definition. Projects carried out by a federal agency, those carried out with federal financial assistance, and those requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. But today's decision addresses only the first and last elements. In effect, the FCC reads projects carried out with federal financial assistance out of the law. Yet going forward, it is highly likely that small cells are going to be deployed using federal financial assistance, like, for instance, using the Mobility Fund. That's the Universal Service Fund that will support updated wireless service in rural areas to the tune of $4.53 billion. That's not a small amount, and we won't improve 5G deployment in rural areas by sweeping this legal problem under the rug. This is especially true when there are different paths we can take. For instance, even if small cell deployment is determined to be an undertaking, the FCC has authority to find, consistent with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's rules, that it has no further obligations under Section 106 if deployment has no more than a de minimis impact on historic properties. In short, there are other ways to address these issues, and I wish we could explore them here. Third and finally, this decision removes many wireless facilities from environmental oversight. If our environmental assessment process is too complex or too lengthy, we should fix it. But tossing this process out is unsupported by the record. In fact, there is so little discussion of the consequences of this change in our docket, the White House Council on Environmental Quality wrote us a letter on this subject that is devoid of any substantive analysis and offers only the most superficial support. We should do better than this. In sum, this decision does not clear the way for 5G. It does not make us 5G ready. It only guarantees that a messy series of legal challenges will follow in its wake. I regret that we did not delay today's vote to fix these problems. I can only hope that with this crude effort, we do not further risk our leadership in 5G as a result.
If the United States is going to lead the world in 5G, we need to modernize our wireless infrastructure regulations. Our efforts to unleash spectrum for consumer use are necessary, but they aren't sufficient to secure our 5G future. In fact, they'll be pointless if carriers cannot deploy the physical infrastructure needed to bring next-generation services to the American people. And unfortunately, our current wireless infrastructure rules are a poor fit for the 5G networks of the future. They were designed with 200-foot towers in mind, not the highly densified networks of small cells that will be common in the 5G world. But don't just take my word for it. Consider these comments. 5G is not a technology. It is a revolution. The nature of the technology makes the associated costs and fees all the more critical. There are just over 200,000 cell towers in the U.S., but there may be millions of small cell sites in the 5G future. If siting for a small cell takes as long and costs as much as the siting for a cell tower, few communities will ever have the benefits of 5G. We recognize that this is a major concern. That was my immediate predecessor, Chairman Wheeler, speaking 2 years ago about the problems of our 5G wireless infrastructure regulations. And comments like that are why this order today is so important. We take a giant leap forward in updating our wireless infrastructure rules. By cutting unnecessary red tape, we will make it substantially easier for carriers to build next-generation wireless networks throughout the United States. That means faster and more reliable wireless services for American consumers and businesses. That means more wireless innovation, such as novel applications based on the Internet of Things. And ultimately, that means American leadership in 5G. Specifically, we clarify today that small cells are inherently different from large towers, so they shouldn't face identical regulatory review under the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. We also streamlined the process for tribal review notifications through our tower construction notification system. In developing today's order, we have engaged extensively, and I have personally, with tribal nations, intertribal organizations, and state and local historic preservation officers. These consultations have improved our work product. For example, tribes complained that wireless companies sometimes give them insufficient information about proposed macro tower deployments that could potentially affect historic properties. And so, today's order therefore requires infrastructure siting applicants to give potentially affected tribal nations and Native Hawaiian organizations a standardized set of information for undertakings going forward. Providing this information at the initial notification stage, at the outset, will enable tribes to more efficiently determine whether projects may affect historic properties of religious or cultural significance. But we also heard from numerous parties seeking to deploy infrastructure about abuse of the review process, including some tribal nations charging upfront fees even before a response. Commissioner O'Reilly outlined some examples. In addition to that, one company paid over $15,000 to install a single small cell in downtown Milwaukee. Yet another company stated that 26% of the small cell deployment costs, including for equipment, came from historic preservation and environmental review alone. Extrapolating that out to the thousands of small cells needed for next generation services, it becomes clear. You can stick with the regulatory status quo, or you can have 5G. You cannot have both. To address that issue, we are going back to following the law. Aside from deterring deployment, upfront fees contradict Advisory Council on Historic Preservation guidance. Because these fees are inconsistent with both law and consumer welfare, we will not coerce private entities into paying them going forward. The other piece of today's order speeds wireless infrastructure deployment by eliminating the requirement that applicants file environmental assessments solely due to the location of a proposed facility in a floodplain, as long as certain conditions are met. Here, too, we are reducing unnecessary barriers to the construction of next-generation networks. Now, today's order would not have been possible without the hard work of Commissioner Carr, who I tasked with leading our efforts on the wireless infrastructure front. I would like to thank him and his staff for their skillful work on this order, and I look forward to collaborating with them as we address additional barriers to deployment in the months to come. And I would particularly like to thank all of the staff of the FCC who have worked diligently on wireless infrastructure issues over the past year, and especially those who worked on this item. Thanks to Saurabh Chabra, Aaron Goldschmidt, Garnet Hanley, Leon Jackler, Dan Margolis, Daryl Pay, Erica Rosenberg, Jennifer Salas, Dana Schaefer, David Saratsky, Jill Springer, Jeff Steinberg, Don Stockdale, Suzanne Tatro, and Mary Claire York from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Ashley Boisel, Deborah Broderson, Tom Johnson, Marcus Mayer, and Linda Oliver from the Office of General Counsel, Matthew Duchesne, Barbara Espin, and Patrick Weber from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Adrian Denisek, Holly Sauer, and Michael Wagner from the Media Bureau, Kathy Williams from the Office of Managing Director, Shanna Wilkerson from the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, Chris Anderson, Ken Burnley, Megan Henry, David Platinsky, and Michael Wilhelm from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and Kathy Harvey, Jason Koslowski, Joanne Lukanik, Aspa Perutzis, Kevin Pittman, and Michael Scarato from the Enforcement Bureau. And I'll close with this. Lately, there has been a lot of talk about American leadership in 5G. But talk is cheap. Action is what actually matters. And now is the time for action. A vote for this order is a vote for concrete action that will help the United States lead the world in 5G. It is a vote for better, faster, and cheaper mobile broadband for American consumers. It is a vote for making the United States the best home for wireless innovation and investment. And it is a vote to extend digital opportunity to more of our citizens. The future is a bright one, and it is a future that I am determined to deliver by supporting this order. We will now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
I dissent.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I dissent.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted as with editorial privileges requested. The gentleman is out of order. The item is adopted. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Ramazzini
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the second item on your agenda, entitled Advanced Methods to Target and Eliminate Unlawful Robocalls, will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Weber, whenever you and your team are all settled, feel free to take the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today I am pleased to announce or introduce an item that addresses a long-standing problem for consumers and businesses both: unwanted calls to reassign numbers. When a phone number is reassigned to a new consumer, that person may receive calls intended for the consumer who previously had that number. These calls are an annoyance to the consumers who receive them and waste the time and efforts of the callers, while subjecting them to potential liability. With today's second further notice of proposed rulemaking, we propose and seek comment on ways to address this problem for the benefit of both consumers and callers. Before turning the presentation over to CGB staff, I would like to thank the Office of General Counsel, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, and the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis for their assistance. With me this morning are Kurt Schroeder, Chief of CGB's Consumer Policy Division, John B. Adams, Deputy Chief, and Josh Zeldis, Attorney Advisor in the division. Josh will present the item.
Great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The second further notice of proposed rulemaking before you seeks comment on ways to address the problem of unwanted calls to reassign numbers. Both consumer groups and callers have asked for a solution to this problem. Today's item, therefore, proposes to make one or more databases available to give callers the comprehensive and timely information they need to avoid calling reassigned numbers. The item seeks comment on various aspects of a reassigned numbers database, including the type and format of information that callers need from such a database, how comprehensive and timely the data needs to be in order for the data to be effective, how to minimize the burden on service providers supplying the information, any restrictions or limitations on callers' access to and usage of the database, and how to minimize callers' cost to use a database. The item also seeks comment on the best way for service providers to report reassigned number information and for callers to access that information. Specifically, the item seeks comment on three alternatives. One, requiring service providers to report reassigned number information to a single FCC-designated database. Two, requiring service providers to report such information to one or more commercial data aggregators. Or three, allowing service providers to report such information to commercial data aggregators on a voluntary basis. Finally, the item seeks comment on whether, and if so, how the Commission should adopt a safe harbor from liability under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act for those callers that choose to use a reassigned numbers database. We recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldis. If I'm not mistaken, this is your first presentation at an open meeting.
Yep.
If so, well done.
Thank you.
We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Hello. This is Jason with British Luxury Automotive.
I thought you were doing a Lionel Richie rendition there for a second. It's like,
I am calling to remind you that your 2017 Aston Martin is due for maintenance. Now, since I never owned such a vehicle, though it is my birthday and the day still young, nor have I had a prior relationship with this company, for me, this call would be a clear example of an unwanted, and I say unwanted in lower caps, telephone call. Chances are great that millions of Americans are in possession of a reassigned number that was previously used by an individual who has done business with a company or two. This is not surprising, given that by one estimate, approximately 100,000 telephone numbers are reassigned by our wireless carriers every day. However, given that the largest source of informal complaints at the FCC is unwanted calls, including robocalls, we must ask ourselves an important question. What can this agency do about this persistent problem? Today, I am pleased to say, we seek answers by teeing up a notice of proposed rulemaking aimed at addressing the problem of unwanted calls to reassigned numbers. My preference, and that of most commenters to last year's notice of inquiry, would be to establish a single, comprehensive reassigned numbers database. This, I believe, would be the most effective means of providing callers with the information necessary to avoid making phone calls to reassign numbers. The NPRM tees up this concept as well as 3 possible approaches for seeking reassigned number information. I look forward to the robust record that will follow, as well as ensuring that consumer privacy is protected. Thanks are due to the staff of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for your continued efforts to combat unwanted phone calls, and the only thing that could make this brighter is a 2018 Aston Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I appreciate the chair. I'm going to submit my statement, but just make the point that we're going to need to reassess the creation of a reassigned number database given the outcome of the decision from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals last week. And I think that's going to have a major factor in how we go about this, and I look forward to that process.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Cart.
Thanks. In 1996, the television show The Simpsons featured a plot line in which Homer Simpson finds a discarded autodialer, a AT5000 to be particular, in the trash. He uses it to place pre-recorded calls to his fellow Springfield residents, telling them that they will obtain the secret to eternal happiness if they send $1 to Happy Dude. In the end, Homer is caught by the police and directed to apologize to everyone he scammed, which he does via robocall. In his words, if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, send $1 to Sorry Dude. In envisioning the pervasive nature of unwanted robocalls, the Simpsons might once again have predicted the future. These intrusive calls have become a far too common nuisance for far too many Americans. That's why Congress passed the TCPA in the first place, to prevent unwanted robocalls while allowing for legitimate communications between businesses and consumers. The FCC has an important role to play in implementing this statutory scheme. But in 2015, the prior FCC exceeded the scope of its authority and reached a decision of eye-popping sweep, as a unanimous D.C. Circuit put it just last week, in reversing significant parts of that decision. Thankfully, this FCC has been endeavoring to shift course. We've elevated robocalls to our top enforcement priority, and we've already taken important steps to combat unlawful calls. One issue, with last week's court decision, we now have additional clarity about the path ahead. And one issue we can tackle is a better approach to dealing with reassigned numbers, which is an issue, as we've heard, that occurs when a consumer gives a business permission to call them, but then their telephone number is subsequently reassigned to another consumer. The database idea we put forward in this notice can help reduce the number of those unwanted calls while ensuring that we're not targeting callers that are following best practices. I want to thank my colleagues for their willingness to include several edits that I requested on this item, including the addition of data detailing the scope of the reassigned numbers problem, as well as a clear acknowledgement that carriers might not be tracking when phone numbers are reassigned. Additionally, we correctly ask about the technical and operational costs for carriers that would participate in a reassigned numbers database. Finally, I'm glad that we're including bigger picture questions about how this notice fits within the broader efforts the FCC is taking to combat robocalls. Thanks to the staff of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for your hard work on this item. It has my support. And speaking of predicting the future, I've never doubted the foresight of our Senate overseers. And since I just saw that Senator Thune and Markey have already put out an announcement applauding our adoption of this decision, I will move forward with post haste and get to the vote.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I used to think it was Rachel from Card Member Services I disliked most. But then it was the agent from the Internal Revenue Service with his final notice of an imminent lawsuit. Now it's the calls with spoof numbers that look like family and friends, but when I answer the line, I get an automated voice offering me a cruise or debt relief or something else I did not ask for, do not want, and do not need. I don't think I should have to choose which of these robocalls I detest most. No one should. But it's come to this. The sheer volume of robocalls we receive is insane. Year in and year out, they represent the largest single category of complaints, both here at the Federal Communications Commission and also with our colleagues at the Federal Trade Commission. Let's put a number on just how ridiculous this situation is. Since I started speaking a little over a minute ago, 5,000 robocalls have been made. That's crazy. So it's a good thing that this agency has set its sights on fixing this problem. To this end, here we initiate a rulemaking that proposes a database for reassigned numbers. This kind of database would make it possible for calling parties to identify numbers that have been changed. That means if someone moves and their number winds up with someone else, it would be listed here. Then, if all goes according to plan, parties would be able to check this database before making calls. I support developing this database, so I will offer my approval in part. But let's get real. This is an effort to provide a legal green light for robocallers. As long as they consult this list before dialing, they will be free from liability under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. So this protects robocallers. Let me repeat that. This protects robocallers. The real question is, what are we doing to protect consumers? And the answer is not enough. It has been 6 months since this agency initiated any enforcement action against a robocaller. It has been 9 months since this agency proposed call authentication standards to help stop fraudulent calls. It has been nearly a year and a half since the robocall strike force identified Shaken and Stirred as a technology to reduce robocalls that, by the way, our neighbors to the north in Canada are already putting in place. In the meantime, the courts have just handed down a big decision when it comes to our robocall rules, and we're going to need to respond. That will mean defining auto dialers and how they can be used to call millions of consumers. It could also mean revisiting just how consumers can revoke consent that they may have previously given companies to make calls. Add all this up, and we have a lot of work to do. And we have been too slow to do it. Because this rulemaking takes only the smallest stab at a massive problem, I dissent in part. When it comes to robocalls, we can and should be doing so much more.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr went with an effective but somewhat dated reference to 1996. I'll go with something much more contemporary. During the final season of Seinfeld in 1998, Elaine gets a new phone number that used to belong to her recently deceased elderly neighbor. She soon begins receiving up to 6 calls a day from the neighbor's grandson, who is looking for his Gammy. Elaine quickly becomes fed up and breaks the news to him. "Goodbye, Bobby. Don't call anymore. I'm dead now. Gotta go." Unfortunately, many consumers share this frustration over getting repeated calls intended for someone else. This is especially true in the case of robocalls to reassigned numbers. Today, when you change your phone number, you probably don't notify everyone who has called you in the past, including businesses to which you have given permission to call. So when your old number is reassigned, the new holder of that number may get calls that are intended for you. These misdirected calls are a nuisance to the consumers who receive them. And at the same time, legitimate businesses, through no fault of their own, waste their time and effort calling the wrong consumers while subjecting themselves to potential liability under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA. Well, what can the FCC do to tackle this reassigned numbers problem? As the D.C. Circuit unanimously recognized last week, we have been exploring ways to reduce unwanted robocalls to reassigned numbers. And today we take another step toward developing a solution. Specifically, we propose to ensure that businesses have access to one or more databases that contain the comprehensive and timely information they need to avoid calling reassigned numbers. In addition, we seek public input on whether and how the FCC should extend safe harbor protection under the TCPA to those businesses that choose to use such a database. We also seek comment on 3 different ways for service providers to report phone number reassignments and for businesses to access that information. Should we require providers to report reassignment data to a single FCC-designated database? Should we make them report the information to one or more of the data aggregators in the marketplace today? Or should we allow providers to report reassignment information to data aggregators voluntarily? With a robust record, we hope to adopt an approach that is easy to use and cost-effective for callers while minimizing the reporting burdens on service providers. As usual, our initiatives to reduce unwanted robocalls are a team effort. Thank you to all of the staff that have worked so hard on this item: John B. Adams, Micah Caldwell, Kurt Schroeder, Mark Stone, Patrick Weber, and Josh Zeldis from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Bill Layton, Rick Mallon, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson from the Office of General Counsel, William Anderley, Heather Hendrickson, Marilyn Jones, Michelle Sclater, and Ann Stevens from the Wireline Competition Bureau, Christy Thompson from the Enforcement Bureau, Robert Cannon and Wayne Layton from the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis, and Belford Lawson from the Office of Communications Business Opportunities. With your efforts, we are moving one step closer to finding serenity now when it comes to unwanted calls. We will now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the great work on this item. Madam Secretary, please announce the next item on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 3, entitled Location-Based Routing for Wireless 911 Calls, will be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Chief Folks, whenever you and your team are ready, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Consumers have a right to expect that when they dial 911 on their mobile phones, their call will be routed to the appropriate 911 call center that can promptly dispatch emergency responders to their location. Unfortunately, this does not always happen. The 911 system has long been configured to route wireless calls based on the location of the cell tower that handles the call, not the actual location of the caller. In some circumstances, such as when a wireless 911 call is made near a state or county border, that call may be received by the cell tower in the neighboring jurisdiction, which connects that call to a 911 call center that does not serve the caller's location. In such situations, the 911 call must be transferred to the correct 911 call center. The call transfer process consumes time and resources in both 911 call centers and ultimately delays the ability of first responders to provide necessary aid. However, recent advances in technology suggest that in many situations, it is now feasible to route 911 calls in the first instance based on the caller's actual location instead of the location of the handling cell tower. Therefore, today, we present a notice of inquiry exploring how the agency might best encourage and facilitate a transition from tower-based routing to location-based routing of wireless 911 calls. With me at the table today from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau are David Firth, Deputy Bureau Chief Michael Wilhelm, Chief of the Policy and Licensing Division, and Austin Randazzo, Attorney Advisor in the Policy and Licensing Division. I would like to thank the division and other Bureau staff for their hard work on this item, as well as the other bureaus and offices that contributed. Mr. Randazzo will present the item.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good morning, Chairman Pai and Commissioners. As Chief Folks noted, routing of wireless 911 calls based on cell tower location can lead to the wrong 911 call center answering the call and having to transfer that call to the correct 911 call center that serves the caller's location. In the draft notice before you today, we initiate an inquiry into the feasibility of addressing this problem by transitioning from tower-based routing to location-based routing, in which wireless carriers would use real-time information about the caller's location to route 911 calls to the correct PSAP in the first instance. The notice broadly examines the potential benefits and costs of transitioning to location-based routing, as well as the technical challenges and operational implications of such a transition. First, the notice seeks additional data on the frequency of 911 call misrouting and its impact on public safety. For example, what proportion of wireless 911 calls are delayed due to the need to reroute them to the correct 911 call center? And how long is the typical delay? Second, the notice seeks comment on the current state of location-based routing technologies, as well as potential location-based routing solutions recommended by the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council 5, also known as CISRIC 5, in September 2016. Third, the notice seeks information on the means available to the Commission to facilitate improvements in 911 routing and reduce the likelihood of misrouted 911 calls, including the promotion of voluntary best practices, the implementation of incentive-based mechanisms, and regulatory action. The Bureau recommends adoption of this notice and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Randazzo. And here, too, I believe this is your first foray to the presentation table.
It is.
So, congratulations and a job well done.
Thank you.
I'll overlook your boss's inappropriate use of an Eagles pin here at the open meeting. Commissioner Clyburn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Any delay in 911 call response time can mean the difference between life and death. When seeking the assistance of first responders, no explanation for delay could ever bring comfort to a victim's family or friends. There is little wonder that many ask, if Uber and Lyft can locate me within seconds, then why is it so difficult for police and other public safety officials? Of the 80% of the 240 million mobile phone calls to 911 each year, it is estimated that as many as 10,000 lives could be saved each year if the 911 emergency dispatching system were able to reach callers just 1 minute faster. One way to speed up response times is to integrate new location technologies into our emergency communications networks. In order for location-based routing to be effective in delivering the 911 call to the appropriate PSAP or public safety access point, the location needs to be calculated in 5 seconds or less with a high or fairly high degree of accuracy. Legacy location technologies such as GPS are not capable of providing a location determination within 5 seconds. 20 to 30 seconds is more likely. As a result, wireless 911 calls continue to be routed based on cell tower location because the tower location is known immediately. That means the call is more likely to be routed to the PSAP nearest the cell tower instead of the one nearest to the actual location of the emergency. Fortunately, a report that the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, or CISRIC, issued in September of 2016 found that new technologies may be able to provide a more precise location data than the tower location within the necessary 5-second window. It is therefore my hope that today's notice of inquiry will incentivize the public safety, commercial communications, and technology communities to work together and help us to expeditiously develop a solution. Time is of the essence. My thanks to the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau on this truly important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my longer statement and make a couple of points. A notice of inquiry seems completely appropriate at this time on this issue, as the Commission would benefit from more information about the scope of the problem, to what extent misrouted calls are causing response delays for first responders, the state of location-based technologies, and whether the implementation of NG 911 would mitigate such delays. Going forward, it would also be helpful to know whether any Commission action should be taken now or after NG 911 upgrades are done. Additionally, the rerouting problems central to today's item are likely to be more prevalent along the boundaries of PSAPs. Therefore, I once again suggest that the Commission and the public safety community must examine the consolidation of PSAPs issue. While the exact numbers of PSAPs fluctuate depending on the source, there are more than 5,700 PSAPs in the United States, serving approximately 3,100 counties. Not only would consolidation lead to certain efficiencies and reduce overall operational costs, but it would also lower the cost to upgrade to NG 911 and decrease the instances where a call is misrouted to a neighboring PSAP. Earlier this week I was in Rhode Island and I got a chance to see their unified statewide PSAP, and while it's a small state and it does have a number of other issues, they were able to function notwithstanding that they had only one PSAP. And so I'll submit my longer statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
You're not going back there anytime soon, are you?
Well,
Just think about it for a moment.
I will look for your longer statement to see those issues. Last month, as many of us know, marked the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call. At 2 p.m. on February 16, 1968, the Speaker of the Alabama House of Representatives, Rankin Fight, dialed 911. He was connected to the Haleyville, Alabama police station where Congressman Tom Bevel answered the call. Much has changed since that ceremonial first call. Today, for instance, over 240 million calls are placed to 911 each year in the U.S., and an estimated 80% of those calls come from a wireless phone. It's our job at the FCC to help ensure that every one of those calls reaches a public safety official who can help. As Chief Folks indicated, in times of crisis, no one should wonder whether our 911 system is going to fail. But as today's notice of inquiry highlights, the system is not perfect. Right now, when a caller dials 911 from a cell phone, the system will often route the call to a public safety answering point, or PSAP, based on the location of the cell tower that handles the call. In some cases, that tower can be miles away from the caller, and this can result in misrouted 911 calls, particularly where the caller is located near the geographic boundary between two different PSAPs. Unfortunately, these misrouted calls must then be transferred to the correct PSAP, which adds precious seconds of delay in an emergency when that can be seconds too many. This concern is not merely hypothetical. In 2015, a D.C. resident woke up to the crashing sound and footsteps coming up the stairs. She hid in a closet, called 911. But her call was mistakenly routed to a 911 dispatch center in Prince George's County, Maryland. While she remained huddled in the closet, the dispatch center eventually rerouted the call to 911 operators in D.C. Thankfully, she was unharmed, but by the time the police arrived, the thieves had escaped. And there are many stories like these and others that have had much worse outcomes. That's why I support today's inquiry, which moves forward with ideas for reforming our wireless 911 call routing rules. Location technologies have now advanced to the point where carriers may be able to route wireless calls directly to the correct PSAP in many more cases, though technical challenges remain. So I'm glad that we're seeking comment on the recommendations in the CISRIC report and thinking creatively about ways to transition away from tower-based routing. I'm also pleased that the item asks about implementing location-based routing as we transition from legacy 911 to NG 911. We need to be mindful that any steps we take in this proceeding are consistent with that broader transition. And I look forward to reviewing the record on that point. So I want to thank the staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for their diligent work on this item. I'm glad the Commission is taking up this important matter. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
One day when the unthinkable occurs, you might have to pick up the phone and call 911. Before any police radio crackles, fire engine blares, or ambulance races, you will need to reach a 911 operator, and that's one call you need to go through. I know, I've watched our nation's 911 operators in action in more than 24 call centers all across the country, from Vermont to Virginia, Colorado to California, and Alaska to Arkansas. And each and every one, I saw those operators take their calls with steely calm and then help ensure that help is on the way. But what I saw in Little Rock in Arkansas actually stays with me. The call center was active. It was small, but the desks were humming as the calls came in. And the pride those public safety officials had for their work was palatable. But the one thing that was most memorable, I learned that in the city of Little Rock, if you call 911 using your wireless phone in the corner of the 911 call center, your call will not get routed to Little Rock. Instead, it will be answered by a 911 call center in North Little Rock, which is all the way on the other side of the Arkansas River. That's unnerving. When you make a 911 call, accuracy matters. That kind of imprecision from calling should leave us all concerned. Because when emergency strikes and you call 911 from any phone, anywhere, you need first responders to find you and find you fast. Here's the good news. With this notice of inquiry, we explore why some of those 911 calls are being routed to the wrong call center. Though we know this is often the result of the growth of wireless technology and the piecemeal way that our 911 systems have come together over time, we're going to try to do something about it. To this end, we ask questions to quantify how many calls go to incorrect call centers and how often this problem occurs. We also ask about recommendations that have been made on this subject by our Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. This effort is good, it's important, and it has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. As has been stated, in an emergency, every second counts. But too often, those seconds dribble away because a wireless 911 call is misrouted. Just ask the family of Chanel Anderson. Chanel was delivering newspapers in suburban Atlanta a few days before Christmas 2014 when her car took a wrong turn and plunged into a pond. And critically for this story, that pond was in Cherokee County, but only 100 yards from the Fulton County line. Unable to escape her vehicle, which quickly became engulfed by water, Chanel used her cell phone to call 911. She reached a 911 dispatcher in Fulton County and provided her exact address. But the dispatcher couldn't locate the address that Chanel provided because it was for a location in Cherokee County. Precious minutes passed, and then by the time the authorities in Fulton County figured out that they needed to transfer her call to Cherokee County, it was too late. Although first responders were able to pull her body from the submerged car and to restart her heart, Chanel fell into a coma and died about a week later. Now, this tragedy happened because today's 911 system routes a wireless 911 call to a call center based on the location of the cell tower that's closest to the caller rather than the caller's location. In Chanel's case, that meant that her call was misrouted to Fulton County because the cell tower nearest her was located there instead of Cherokee County where she actually was. So with this notice of inquiry, we aim to understand just how common this problem is, how we can avoid potentially deadly delays in responding to wireless 911 calls, and which location-based routing technologies could help. Underscoring the importance of this inquiry is that every 911 call center I visit these days reports that the majority of emergency calls they get come from wireless phones. Just last month, as Commissioner Carr noted, on the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call, I visited with Karima Holmes, the director of the Office of Unified Communications in the District of Columbia. Ms. Holmes told me that the district received approximately 10,000 misrouted 911 calls in 2017 alone. These calls had to be transferred to Maryland authorities. Conversely, many thousands of calls received in Maryland had to be transferred back into the district. Now, these statistics are startling, and it makes you wonder how many more have faced a fate like Chanel's, or could. So I want to thank the staff for all their hard work on this item. Rochelle Cohen, Lisa Folks, David Firth, Roberto Mussenden, Erica Olson, Linda Pintro, Austin Randazzo, Emily Talaga, and Michael Wilhelm from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and David Horowitz and Doug Klein from the Office of General Counsel. We really appreciate the effort. With that, we'll proceed to a vote. Commissioner Clyburn?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested, except to the extent necessary to mention the Philadelphia Eagles in this item. Thank you, commissioners. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda? Hey, you asked for it. Go on. It's like a big eagle spin.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item on your agenda will also be presented by the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau and is entitled Amendment of Part 90 of the Commission's Rules. And once again, Lisa Folks, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. It is with some trepidation that I turn the floor back over to Ms. Folks.
Good afternoon again. Chairman Pai and Commissioners. Today we present a sixth further notice of proposed rulemaking that will seek to comment on proposals to stimulate use of and investment in the 4.9 gigahertz band. This band is currently configured as a contiguous 50 megahertz block of spectrum that is designated for public safety use. Since its designation for public safety in 2002, the band has experienced only a mild uptake of users compared to the heavy use of other public safety bands. Our goal is to promote increased public safety use of the band while opening up the spectrum to additional uses that will encourage a more robust market for equipment and greater innovation. With me at the table from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau are David Firth, Michael Wilhelm, and Tom Eng, an engineer in the Policy and Licensing Division. I would like to thank Renee Rowland, Special Counsel to the Bureau, Dr. Razul Safavian, engineer in the division, and the other bureaus and offices who have provided their expertise and contributed to this item. Mr. Eng will present the item.
Thank you, Chief Folks. Good afternoon, Chairman Pai and Commissioners. The sixth further notice of proposed rulemaking before you makes several proposals on the 4.9 gigahertz band, consistent with the goal of promoting increased public safety use of the band and opening up the spectrum to additional uses. 1, the notice proposes to expand the channel aggregation bandwidth limit from 20 to 40 megahertz. 2, it proposes to allow public safety, aeronautical, mobile, and robotic use on 5 megahertz of spectrum to allow, for example, public safety aircraft to transmit video. 3, it proposes to require applicants for new stations and licensees seeking modifications to submit to frequency coordination to ensure operations will be adequately protected from interference. 4, it proposes to require both new applicants and existing licensees to submit site-based information to ULS, which would provide a more granular view of usage in the band and more accurately identify available spectrum for new users. 5, it proposes to allow regional planning committees to amend their regional plans to incorporate the 4.9 gigahertz band and recommend operational parameters to optimize spectrum efficiency. 6, the item proposes to give primary status to certain point-to-point and point-to-multipoint links and to narrow the beam width of directional antennas in the band to encourage channel reuse. 7, the notice proposes to harmonize the construction period for facilities from 18 months down to 12 months, consistent with other Part 90 services. 8, it proposes to grandfather all existing licensees in the band and their install systems. Lastly, it seeks comment on alternatives to expand access to the band, including authorizing critical infrastructure industry use, spectrum leasing, sharing by public safety and non-public safety users, or commercial use. The Bureau recommends adoption of the notice and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eng, and well done on your maiden presentation at an open meeting. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
As the demand for wireless services continues to grow, it is imperative that the FCC take steps to ensure underutilized spectrum bands are used efficiently. This is as true for spectrum allocated to public safety as it is for the bands used to support commercial wireless broadband services. When the Commission allocated 50 megahertz of spectrum in the 4.9 gigahertz band for fixed and mobile services back in 2012, it expected the development of new broadband applications, such as high-speed digital technologies, for scene management and dispatch operations to be widespread. Unfortunately, the local public safety entities have yet to take full advantage of this band. Of the more than 90,000 public safety jurisdictions, fewer than 3% hold licenses in the 4.9 gigahertz band. Fortunately, around 2015, the public safety community and equipment manufacturers began offering fresh ideas on how to make more efficient use of this band. APCO, NIPSTIC, and others recommended that public safety equipment include the 4.9 gigahertz band in chipsets that also include Wi-Fi and 4G LTE technologies. This could allow the public safety community to benefit from some of the same innovative technologies and services used by the broader consumer marketplace. They also advised the Commission to permit larger 40 megahertz band channels, expand license eligibility to other members of critical infrastructure industry, and encourage better frequency coordination. Law enforcement interest in drones and robotic technologies could further innovation, and the proposals in today's further notice builds upon these recommendations and more. So I am pleased to support the item and thank the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for their work on encouraging more efficient use of the public airwaves.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been 16 years since the 4.9 gigahertz band was allocated to the public safety community, and it's still woefully underutilized. That is not sustainable in an environment in which every megahertz of spectrum, especially below 6 gigahertz, needs to be fully scrutinized and maximized in quick order. While the Commission's original allocation was more than likely well-intentioned, it is way past its time to take a fresh look at this 50 megahertz of spectrum. For these reasons, I support this notice of proposed rulemaking to consider a new path forward for this band. At the same time, I'm not so keen on several of the options proposed in the item and the direction it may be headed. For instance, the majority of the item discusses technical and licensing modifications to increase use of the band, and then considers such ideas as expanding access for critical infrastructure entities, allowing public safety to lease their spectrum, and permitting sharing where public safety would have a priority over other users. Only at the very end does this item discuss the idea of redesignating this spectrum for commercial use. As Commissioner Clyburn went through some of the background, I will skip that point and go on to the point to say, well, the uses envisioned were primarily high-speed data technologies and wireless local area networks for managing emergency incident scenes, along with potential dispatch operations and vehicle personal communications. It appears a limited spectrum in use may actually be utilized now for other purposes. We will obtain more information through this proceeding. Some entities appear to be using the spectrum for video security and roadway cameras, internet access for travelers and tourists, collection and communication of traffic and weather data, speed and message signs along roads, and surveillance. These purposes do not fall into the category of cutting-edge technologies that will enhance public safety's ability to share critical and time-sensitive information during emergencies and other critical situations. In light of the underutilization of this band by public safety for non-public safety purposes and the relative progress of FirstNet, I would argue, and I know some of my colleagues agree with this, that it is time to redesignate this valuable spectrum for commercial use. Today's notice provides the opportunity to contemplate whether the spectrum, which is located in close proximity to the 5 gigahertz unlicensed band, should be allocated for unlicensed or licensed use, what the technical rules should be, and how the Commission should deal with the incumbents. I thank the Chairman for accepting edits to this section to ensure that we'll have a fulsome record on these issues. Additionally, we need to recognize that the current Mobile Now bill, which is on the path to become law in a scant few days, requires the Commission and NTIA to identify 255 megahertz of federal and non-federal spectrum for fixed and mobile wireless broadband, with at least 100 megahertz under 8 gigahertz for unlicensed use and 100 megahertz under 6 gigahertz for licensed service. It is likely that the 4.9 gigahertz band will be needed to reach these spectrum totals. In sum, this spectrum is underutilized, and as such, I've advocated in other circumstances, such as the DSRC and the 5.9 gigahertz band, it is time to reconsider and correct past mistakes before another decade goes by. I look forward to engaging with interested parties and my colleagues on this valuable spectrum and ensuring that it is put to the most efficient and best use. Thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. As Commissioner O'Reilly noted, it's been 16 years since the Commission reallocated 50 megahertz of spectrum from federal users to public safety officials. 6 years ago, the Commission remarked that the spectrum's use has, quote, fallen short of its potential. Today, with only 3.5% of potential licensees actually using the band, we repeat that statement of disappointment. This notice represents another attempt to promote more intensive use of the 4.9 gigahertz band. It asks about adding flexibility to our rules by proposing greater channel aggregation and new uses of the spectrum. It seeks comment on requiring more from users, including by proposing more stringent frequency coordination and tighter construction deadlines. I certainly support the reason for putting these ideas forward. But in my view, the most valuable part of the notice might be found in some of its last few paragraphs. There we ask whether, in light of the past 16 years of results, we should fundamentally rethink our approach to the band, including opening it up for additional use cases. Over the years, the Commission's spectrum policy has moved away from central planning. We've embraced flexible use approaches and declined requests to micromanage the use of particular bands. This approach, rather than our predictive judgment, has proven to reach better results. So I welcome the chance to explore whether that approach might make sense for the 4.9 gigahertz band as well. And I'm glad that my colleagues agreed to expand the notice's discussion of these ideas, including the changes requested by Commissioner O'Reilly. There are a number of reasons why we've not batted 1,000 in our efforts to put the 4.9 gigahertz band to productive use, and I'm open-minded about whether we need to revisit our prior designations. So I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops, and I want to thank the Wireless Bureau, the Public Safety Bureau, for their work on this item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you to the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for your efforts here on the 4.9 gigahertz band. This is our 6th notice of proposed rulemaking in this underutilized spectrum, and it's my hope that the 6th time is the charm. In the interest of moving things along, I will just offer my support. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. In 2002, a robot vacuum, the Roomba, was introduced to American consumers. And what was initially considered a novelty has since become a mainstay of the marketplace. Today, robot vacuums represent some 20% of the worldwide vacuum market. As we now know, another project was launched back in 2002 as the FCC designated a 50 megahertz swath of contiguous spectrum in the 4.9 gigahertz band for public safety use. Sadly, that initiative hasn't met with similar success. According to the FCC's licensing database, only about 3.5% of potential licensees have actually taken advantage of this band. And considering the massive demand for mobile services and the consequently massive demand for spectrum, preserving a lightly used 4.9 gigahertz band isn't an option. And that's why today's 6th further notice is important. Our goals here are simple: to promote more productive use of the band, to foster the development of new technologies, and to spur investment. We believe that we will unleash the potential of this band with the proposals that we consider here, from aggregating channels into larger blocks to facilitate broadband use, to opening the door to more spectrum sharing. I, like my colleagues, want to thank the staff that worked on this item, from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Rochelle Cohen, Thomas Eng, Lisa Folks, David Firth, Renee Rowland, Rasul Savabian, and Michael Wilhelm, and Deborah Broderson and David Horowitz from the Office of General Counsel. If America has the ingenuity and vision to make a success of robot vacuum cleaners, I am confident with your help we can make a go of the 4.9 gigahertz band. We'll now proceed to vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fifth item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Streamlined Reauthorization Procedures for Assigned or Transferred Television Satellite Stations, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Media Bureau is pleased to present a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes to streamline the process for reauthorizing television satellite stations when they are assigned or transferred in combination with their previously approved parent stations. Joining me at the table are Brendan Holland and Ben Arden, Chief and Deputy Chief of the Industry Analysis Division. Ben will present the item.
Great.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we present this notice of proposed rulemaking proposing to streamline the process for reauthorizing television satellite stations when they are assigned or transferred in combination with their previously approved parent stations. Television satellite stations are full-power broadcast stations that transmit some or all of the programming of a different broadcast television station, referred to as the parent station, which is typically commonly owned with a satellite station. Once authorized by the Commission, television satellite stations are accepted from the broadcast ownership rules, most notably the local television ownership rule. The Commission initially authorized television satellite stations in sparsely populated areas with insufficient economic basis to support full-service stations, and more recently in larger markets when the proposed satellite could not operate as a standalone full-service station. Currently, each time satellite station is assigned or transferred to a different owner, the applicants must demonstrate to the Commission that the station is entitled to retain its satellite status, which requires the same comprehensive showing as an initial satellite station authorization. As part of the Commission's proceeding to modernize its media regulations, commenters argue that this reauthorization process is unnecessarily costly and burdensome, particularly in light of the fact that the Commission has never declined a satellite station reauthorization request. The notice proposes to streamline the reauthorization process for previously approved parent satellite combinations in order to reduce the time and expense incurred by applicants. Specifically, the notice seeks comment on allowing applicants to certify that there has not been any material change in the underlying circumstances that the Commission relied upon in granting the station's current satellite authorization. Applicants would also be required to provide a copy of that authorization decision. Under the proposed approach, the Commission would retain its ability to review such transactions to ensure that they serve the public interests, and existing procedures would provide the opportunity for interested parties to present any objections. The notice also seeks comment on whether to allow for streamlining when a television satellite station is seeking reauthorization in combination with a new parent station. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arden, not least because you made a substantial sacrifice just to make this presentation. As I understand it, you came back all the way from Rwanda to talk about satellite stations in an office building in Southwest D.C.
I did.
Thank you for that.
I take my duties here very seriously for the brief time remaining on my tenure.
That is true dedication. Thank you, sir. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Throughout my nearly 9 years of service on the FCC, I've supported proposals that increase the viability of and standing of our nation's smallest broadcasters. By streamlining the process for the reauthorization of television satellite stations when they are assigned or transferred in combination with their previously approved parent station, the proposal before us today has the potential to fit squarely within this goal while not unduly harming the public interest. I will acknowledge that my preference would have been to vote on the originally circulated version of this item, which tentatively concluded that changing a station's parent constitutes a material change in the underlying circumstances that the Commission relied upon in granting the most recent authorization. Nonetheless, and importantly, the item still acknowledges that transactions involving a change in a satellite station's parent are fact-specific and may have public interest implications. So I will vote to approve the item and look forward to the record that follows. My thanks to the Media Bureau staff, including Michelle Carey, Julie Salavarara, I messed that up, Ben Arden, Brendan Holland, and Sarah Weitzel for their work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we appropriately launched an additional rulemaking to modernize the Commission's regulatory burdens for over-the-air broadcasters. Specifically, this item proposes to streamline costly, lengthy applications for reauthorizing broadcast satellite stations waivers when the satellite station is assigned or transferred. Ultimately, this item will save both applicable broadcasters and the Commission significant resources. Importantly, satellite stations are generally located in rural and economically troubled areas. Yet our current rules requiring the filing of unnecessary paperwork creates a disincentive to invest in these stations. I characterize these applications as unnecessary because they typically require the restatement of what was previously filed to obtain an original waiver, and despite numerous reauthorization requests since 1991, at least 100, the Commission has never used information in these applications to deny such a petition. Therefore, I'm pleased that this item tentatively concludes to streamline the process for reauthorizing satellite waivers when a satellite station is assigned or transferred in combination with its approved parent station. I also appreciate the Chairman and Commissioner Clyburn for working with my office to ask questions on whether we should also streamline the process when a satellite station's parent changes. Again, if the original intent of this waiver was to help struggling stations, the conditions of the satellite station, not the parent station, should be our primary focus. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The Commission has long recognized that satellite stations serve the public interest by bringing television service to sparsely populated communities, one that might otherwise receive no over-the-air signal. Since as far back as 1954, the FCC has authorized these stations, and it's exempted them from our local ownership limits to help attract investment. But in 1991, the FCC determined that before a station could qualify for this exemption, it must make a detailed and particularized showing, including demonstrations that go to signal contours in the underserved nature of the local community. The Commission has been requiring applicants to make this same detailed showing when seeking to reauthorize an existing station in connection with an ownership, transfer, or assignment, even when the underlying facts have not changed. The record in our media modernization proceeding suggests that this redundant regulatory process might be deterring needed investment, particularly in rural and economically depressed parts of the country. Indeed, despite the significant costs both to applicants that must make the showing and to the FCC in reviewing and processing the submissions, the agency has never rejected a reauthorization request. So I support the proposal to streamline these reviews, which includes a check to ensure that interested parties have an opportunity to contest the use of these simplified procedures. A redundant regulatory process should not be what stands in the way of investment in television service for communities. So I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on this item, and I look forward to reviewing the record.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenbristle.
Thank you to the Media Bureau for your work on this rulemaking, streamlining or proposing streamlining the reauthorization of certain types of television satellite stations. In the spirit of that streamlining, I will not have a statement, and I will simply offer my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm not going to be so reticent. Shocker. In 1991, Terminator 2 was released, and that same year, the FCC revised its standards for television satellite stations. These are, as Mr. Arden pointed out, full-power terrestrial broadcast stations that generally retransmit some or all of the programming of another television station, known as the parent station. Among other things, the FCC required applicants seeking to transfer or assign a parent satellite combination to show that the conditions originally warranting satellite status still applied. However, public input in our media modernization initiative suggests that the current reauthorization process is lengthy and excessive and burdensome. It can dissuade potential purchasers from buying satellite stations, which usually, as Commissioner O'Reilly pointed out, are in rural and economically depressed areas and are in need of investment. And so today we specifically suggest streamlining the process for demonstrating that a satellite station remains eligible for satellite status when it's assigned or transferred in combination with its previously approved parent station. The basic point of this is simple. If nothing material has changed, then we don't need or want additional paperwork. Our aim here is to reduce burdens on station owners while still ensuring that the FCC can determine whether reauthorization serves the public interest. I, too, would like to thank the dedicated staff that worked on this notice from the Media Bureau, the aforementioned Ben Arden, Michelle Carey, Brendan Holland, Julie Salavara, and Sarah Whitesell, and from the Office of General Counsel, Dave Consul, and Royce Sherlock. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Now, if I say hasta la vista, then I'll be in trouble, right? So I'll just vote aye.
We'll be back. All right. Commissioner Riley.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on the agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the final item on your agenda today is entitled Amendments of Parts 1, 2, 22, 24, 27, 90 to 95 of the Commission's rules to improve wireless coverage through the use of signal boosters. And Don Stockdale, Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, is back to give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, welcome back to the hot seat.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I am pleased to present to you the Signal Boosters second report in order and second further notice of proposed rulemaking, which would remove personal use restrictions for provider-specific consumer signal boosters, and in the notice of proposed rulemaking, propose to further expand access to consumer signal boosters. I am joined at the table by Suzanne Tétrault, Roger Noel, Kathy Harris, and Amanda Hutink. In addition to the WTB staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Amanda will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We present to you today a second report in order and second further notice of proposed rulemaking that would improve consumers' wireless experience by increasing flexibility in the use of consumer signal boosters. Consumer signal boosters are devices that the general public can purchase and use to extend and improve their wireless coverage in areas where signals are weak, for example, in rural areas with fringe coverage or indoors at public venues, libraries, schools, and offices. These boosters are authorized either as provider-specific, where the booster works only for a single specific provider, or wideband, where the booster will work on the spectrum of any provider within range of the booster. Both types of boosters must comply with strict technical requirements that are designed to ensure that they work out of the box to extend coverage without harming wireless networks. The Commission's rules, adopted in 2013, also limit operation of boosters to specific spectrum bands and to personal use by subscribers of wireless service. By all accounts, the rules have been a success, offering consumers a useful tool while protecting providers' networks. In the second report in order, we build upon the success of our rules by eliminating the personal use restriction on provider-specific boosters so as to allow enterprises to use these boosters for the benefit of employees and the public. For example, a small business would be able to deploy a provider-specific booster for use by its employees and customers who use that provider. In the second further notice, we propose to take 3 further actions to enhance the usefulness and effectiveness of both types of consumer signal boosters. First, we seek comment on whether and how to expand signal booster operations to additional spectrum bands. Second, we propose to revise the rules to accommodate consumer signal boosters embedded within vehicles such as cars, boats, and recreational vehicles. Third, we propose to eliminate the personal use restriction for wideband boosters and to authorize non-subscribers to operate both types of consumer signal boosters. This change would, for example, permit a small business to deploy either type of booster, provider-specific or wideband, for the benefit of its customers, employees, and the general public, regardless of subscriber relationship. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hutink, for that presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Wireless networks, no matter how well engineered, can have the occasional dead zone, particularly indoors. Whether it is calling your mother while pressed up against the kitchen window because that is the only place in your apartment you have cell coverage, or wrongfully concluded that you're getting the silent treatment from your significant other as you step onto or into the elevator. Bad connectivity can mean bad news when you want to keep in touch. Signal boosters, those devices that extend the range of wireless networks into buildings and elsewhere by, you guessed it, boosting the original signal that may be weak, can be an effective means of improving your wireless experience. Today's item advances the goal of greater connectivity by seeking comment on how we can facilitate further use of signal boosters while guarding against harmful interference. We enable broader use of provider-specific boosters by removing the personal use limitation, and I am grateful that my colleagues agreed to my edits that would seek comment on how we can streamline and future-proof the use of signal boosters as much as possible. Doing so would eliminate the need to conduct a new rulemaking every time a new band is opened up for mobile use or the industry finds a new use for signal boosters. I also approve this item because it contains an appropriate signal-to-noise ratio, and while some may say the comments from this bench are inappropriately high in the noise department, I am glad the work by the Bureau can suffer no such criticism. Thanks to the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for the work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I'm going to support the item, and I'll just submit my statement for the record.
All right, Commissioner Carr.
Consumer signal booster rules the FCC adopted in 2013 have been a success. They've helped improve wireless coverage from rural areas to indoor locations without running into interference or other issues. As someone that lives in an English basement apartment, I can appreciate why many consumers want to boost their wireless signal. Today, the Commission builds on the success of our 2013 decision by removing the personal use restriction, which no commenter opposes. We can ensure that businesses, libraries, public safety officials, and others can take steps to enhance their wireless coverage using off-the-shelf technology. While the 2013 rules allow enterprises to use industrial signal boosters, in many cases that option is too expensive or impractical. Indeed, the National Wildfire Suppression Association noted that the personal use restriction has meant that first responders are sometimes unable to improve coverage in emergency situations. Whatever your circumstances, our rule shouldn't unnecessarily prevent you from improving connectivity. So I support today's order. I'm also glad the notice portion of our decision seeks comment on opening up other spectrum bands for signal boosters. A lot has changed since we adopted those rules in 2013. Wireless carriers acquired 600 megahertz spectrum in the incentive auction, and the transition to 5G is pushing the boundaries of what the Commission views as usable spectrum. Given the fast pace of change in the wireless market, our signal booster rules should keep up with the bands that carriers are using while continuing to guard against harmful interference. I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops and want to thank the Wireless Bureau for its work on this item. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Can you hear me now? That was such a great marketing slogan. I think that's because it felt so familiar to all of us. I mean, I know I've asked that question too many times to count, and often it was as I traversed with a mobile device in hand from the kitchen to the living room in my house. In fact, I can tell you with antenna-like accuracy where I have a strong signal at home and precisely where it fades. I know so many people have this experience, even in metropolitan areas where coverage is good. I also know lots of rural consumers are not so lucky. And 5 years ago, the FCC took steps to address this problem. It permitted consumers to extend the reach of their wireless networks through the use of signal boosters. And these simple, out-of-the-box devices improve wireless coverage by amplifying signals between wireless devices and networks. At the same time, the agency went to great lengths to ensure that consumers who purchased these devices would be able to enjoy better wireless service without interfering or disrupting mobile use by their neighbors or the spectral needs of our first responders. Fast forward, and our careful choices have been a great success. Hundreds of thousands of new signal boosters have been deployed. They not only improve service for individual consumers, they benefit carriers by reducing the number of dropped calls due to weak signals. Today, we build on that success by eliminating what has proved to be an unnecessary restriction limiting the use of signal boosters by businesses, schools, and public safety. Specifically, we eliminate the personal use restriction for provider-specific signal boosters. And in addition, we ask questions in a rulemaking about further liberalizing our signal booster policies with respect to new spectrum and expanded enterprise uses. I think this is smart. I think it's an efficient approach to the use of our spectrum resources. It's good for consumers everywhere and maybe just in my house too. I'm pleased to offer my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Poor wireless coverage can be a major problem for Americans seeking to conduct business or to get in touch with loved ones. From big city basements to rural office cubicles, many Americans currently experience weak signal strength in areas where they spend much of their time. Signal boosters, which improve wireless coverage by amplifying signals, can help address this problem. In 2013, as has been noted, the Commission took an important step forward when it authorized, with certain conditions, the use of consumer signal boosters for personal use. But more can be done to improve mobile coverage through the use of these boosters. Our current rules restricting boosters to personal use don't allow small businesses and other organizations, like public safety entities, to take full advantage of these devices. Based on the experience to date, we believe these restrictions are no longer necessary. And so today we take steps to provide additional relief. In particular, we end the personal use restriction for provider-specific signal boosters. This will allow small businesses and other enterprise customers to use boosters to improve signal strength for the benefit of employees and the public. We also seek public input on ways to increase the availability of signal boosters by, for example, eliminating the personal use restriction on wideband signal boosters, on expanding the spectrum bands in which signal boosters may operate, and by making it easier to label signal boosters that are embedded in vehicles. Signal boosters are one tool in the toolbox for giving consumers ubiquitous wireless coverage. With our action today, we aim to make that tool even more powerful. So thanks to the staff that worked on this item, in particular, Steve Wenzo, Peter Duranko, Kathy Harris, Amanda Henyk, Heather Moulter, Roger Noel, Tyler Park, Blaise Cinto, Don Stockdale and Suzanne Tatro from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Rashmi Doshi and Tim Harrington from the Office of Engineering and Technology, Erica Olson and Michael Wilhelm from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Rizwan Chowdhury, Charles Cooper, Matthew Gibson, Jeremy Marcus, Kevin Pittman, and Michael Scarrato from the Enforcement Bureau, Shannon Wilkerson from the Office of Communication Business Opportunities, and David Horowitz and Keith McCrickard from the Office of General Counsel. We'll now to proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. The ayes have it. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the hard work. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time? Commissioner Clyburn?
Yes, regrettably Mr. Chairman. I'm still coming to terms with the fact that Claude Aiken, my wireline advisor for nearly 2 years, will depart the FCC this week. When I arrive at staff meetings tired from a red-eye flight, I can always count on Claude to wake me up with those colorful socks. If you think I am fibbing, check them out. I'm sure he hasn't he hasn't let me down with that. In all seriousness, I've benefited from and I'm deeply appreciative of his wise counsel, tireless work ethic, incisive legal and policy guidance, and skillful handling of the many demands this position has required. I often joke with Claude, he doesn't think it's all funny, but I often joke with him about our many differences, but these differences may be take note of something I just heard a couple of days ago from American folk singer Mary Gauthier. And this is one of the most profound things I've ever heard, and it's not going to translate well, but go back and look at that the video. When asked about a musical collaboration with someone who, and I quote from the reporter, on the surface could not be more different, What does that say? The reporter continued to ask her. She said, and I quote, that we need to get the HE double toothpicks away from the surface. Now, she didn't say HE double toothpicks, but I need to go back home to South Carolina, so I had to say that. So I guess what I'm attempting to say is what she mentioned in that statement just more forcefully than I ever would. What motivates me to say what I'm about to say about Claude is this. I have benefited greatly from his wise counsel. It has enabled me and those who interact with our office to get away from the surface. And because we've gotten away from the surface, tried to work out whatever differences we have done a lot of good. I'm grateful to you, Claude. I will miss you, Claude. All the best to you as you share those incredible talents with the rest of the world outside of these commission walls. I think I'm able to call you. I don't think that will violate anything. Even if it does, I'm letting the world know I'm going to violate every time I need some help. Thank you so much, Verity. All the best to you and your family.
Oh. Commissioner Carr, anything?
Just happy birthday to Commissioner Clyburn again, and just real quick, wanted to thank my staff in particular for their help on the wireless infrastructure proceeding over the last 3 weeks. They put a tremendous amount of work in it, including Will Adams, who's still relatively new to the FCC, but he's jumped right in, and he really did play a very big and important role in helping us get to the great result that we reached today. So thank you to Will, and thank you to the team. Really appreciate the effort.
Mr. Chairman, if I might be a little, thank you. I want to say to you, Commissioner, that old adage about we can disagree without being disagreeable holds true here. I just wanted to put that on the record and say thank you to you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before we close the meeting, I did have a few announcements. In particular, I want to start with recognizing and paying tribute to David Ward, who was a longtime attorney in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. He passed away in February last month. Dave was a man of many talents. Among other things, his communications expertise ranged from a job splicing fiber optic cables to being a senior legal advisor in the Bureau's policy and licensing division. He was the Bureau's resident expert when it came to the responsibilities of communications service providers to assist law enforcement. And his knowledge of the law and technology was second to none. It was also invaluable to the FCC's work with the Department of Justice and with other federal agencies. In addition to his FCC work, Dave served more than 20 years in the United States Marine Corps, serving 2 tours of duty in the Persian Gulf, and he attained the rank of lieutenant colonel, and where he dealt with command and control systems. He had a PhD in information sciences, and if that wasn't enough, he held a master's in business administration. He had a list of publications longer than your arm, and he also taught courses to undergrads seeking advanced degrees in information science. Dave was a valued friend and a co-worker to many around these halls, and he was dedicated to his country, to this commission, and, of course, to his family. And to his family, including his daughter, Kristen, who I believe is here, I want to express our deep appreciation for David's almost 20 years of service at the Commission. We, too, will miss him and remember him fondly. I also want to note the passing of Charlie Rhodes, a broadcast engineer and the pioneer of high-definition video and digital television. He was the former chief scientist for the Advanced Television Test Center, ATTC, for many years. The ATTC was critical in the development of a digital TV standard, including ATSC 1.0. And the NAB awarded Mr. Rhodes its Engineering Achievement Award in 1995. One of my predecessors, Dick Wiley, who also served as chairman of the FCC Advisory Committee on Advanced Television Service, put it very well. David was a brilliant engineer who contributed very effectively to our ATSC 1.0 standard development and was one of the most effective engineering minds that I have run into. High praise indeed. Mr. Rhodes will be missed. Not passing, but departing this agency, as mentioned, is Ben Arden. He's leaving the Media Bureau and moving to Rwanda. He worked hard on media ownership issues since the transition, and so I want to thank him for his work. He joined the Industry Analysis Division of the Media Bureau 7.5 years ago, previously having worked with distinction in private practice as a communications attorney. As I understand it, he and his family will be relocating to Kigali, which is, of course, the capital of Rwanda, for 2 years, where his wife will be overseeing a contract for USAID. Safe travels, best wishes, Ben, and I hope your wife does well with the project, and we look forward to hearing from you early and often during your time on the new continent. Also in our office, we have an additional staffer to mention. Nathan Lemur had a baby, Juniper March Lemur. Juniper joins India and Ephraim. It's such hipster names. I just love these names. It's like, of course, if you know Nathan, you wouldn't be surprised by any of that. We're very excited about Lemur 3.0 and look forward to seeing her in the office some point soon. Last but not least, I want to recognize that this is Women's History Month, and so I thought I'd mention a few significant milestones in that regard when it comes to the FCC. Frieda Henyk, she was the first woman to serve as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission. She served for almost 7 years from 1948 until 1955. Her most notable accomplishment while she was at the commission was the reservation of spectrum for non-commercial educational TV stations, which really laid the foundation for public TV as we know it. And the first woman, of course, to serve as chair of the commission is sitting to my right. Commissioner Clyburn was acting chair in 2013. And, of course, there are many other women in leadership in the bureaus of the agency. Chris Monteith in the Wireline Competition Bureau, Rosemary Harold in the Enforcement Bureau, Philadelphia Eagles fan, Lisa Folks in the Public Safety Bureau, and Michelle Carey of the Media Bureau. I want to thank all the women who serve as this agency with distinction every day for their public service. We are glad they apply their expertise on behalf of our efforts. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC Agenda Meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Tuesday, April 17th, 2018.
Until then, we stand adjourned.
Good afternoon. Please go ahead and take your seats. We're ready to get started. If everyone could please take your conversations outside, we're about ready to get started. We're going to do things a little differently today. We're going to have Commissioner Carr join the chairman for questions on the wireless infrastructure item. So the sequencing will be Chairman Pai delivering opening remarks, Commissioner Carr delivering remarks, taking questions on the wireless infrastructure item, and then after that we'll resume normal activities and have the chairman take questions from the press. With that, I'll turn it over to the chairman.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks to the three of you for being here. We happy few, we band of journalists. It's good to see you here at the Commission. Well, good afternoon. I hope everyone enjoyed yesterday's snow day, but neither snow nor rain nor sleet nor hail nor Newman can slow the race for global leadership in 5G. So today the FCC has taken another important step to make sure that the United States stays at the front of the pack. U.S. leadership in 5G will require the deployment of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of densely packed small cells. But until today, the FCC's wireless infrastructure regulations were designed for massive cell towers. That is a showstopper for 5G. No matter how much 5G spectrum you make available for next-generation wireless services, it is all for naught if the infrastructure needed to carry next-generation wireless traffic, can't be built. We simply cannot lead in 5G if we force small cells to jump through the same regulatory hoops that attend to large towers. And that is why the FCC voted this morning to modernize our federal historic preservation and environmental review processes while ensuring that other necessary reviews stay in place. One analysis cited by Commissioner Carr estimates that these changes will lower the cost of network deployment by $1.54 billion over the next 8 years. By lowering the cost of regulatory compliance, we free up more money to be invested in next-generation networks. And by cutting red tape, we expedite the construction of those networks. So with today's vote, we take a critical step towards securing American leadership in 5G, due in no small part to the Herculean efforts by Commissioner Carr and his terrific staff, who I again want to salute. Shifting to another topic, unfortunately, neither snow nor rain nor sleet nor hail can slow the flood of unwanted robocalls, but perhaps strong FCC enforcement and smart FCC rules can. And that's why today we advanced a proposal to tackle the problem of reassigned numbers. Also on the robocall front, the D.C. Circuit last week unanimously overturned the FCC's 2015 decision, a decision that placed every American with a smartphone at risk of violating federal law and being sued for damages. I said at the time, in 2015, that this was regulatory overreach, and I am pleased that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals agreed. Instead of sweeping 300 million Americans into a regulatory dragnet, the FCC under my leadership is focused on targeting the bad actors who bombard Americans with unwanted robocalls. And I would note that we are not done with our work on robocalls for the week. Tomorrow, the FCC will be teaming up with the Federal Trade Commission to convene a joint forum on robocalls. This problem requires an all-hands-on-deck response, and I am pleased that we are once again partnering with the FTC, including my friend, Acting Chairwoman Maureen Olhausen, to protect consumers. The Kansas Jayhawks game is not until later that night, so you guys have no excuse for not checking it out. With that, I would turn it over to Commissioner Carr for any comments that he would care to make.
Thanks. Just off the top, just very thankful that we were able to get this one across the finish line. This was a decision that was literally years in the making. The consultations, the discussions dated back into 2016. And this is really going to be critical for our leadership in 5G, whether it's these cutting-edge new innovations or simply about getting more broadband out there to more Americans. This is really going to make a big difference. We talked a lot today. We heard about economics and the economics of deployment. And with this one decision, we can cut 30% of the costs, the total cost of deploying these small cells. And that's going to free up billions of dollars in capital that can then be turned around to reach communities where it wasn't economical for providers to deploy before, underserved communities. And they don't need to wait any longer to see those new deployments. So it's a great result. And really, as I've looked at the last 3 weeks that this document's been public, I've been really heartened to see the broad base of support that we've received. I talked about it a little bit in my statement, but sort of a band of groups in the telecom space that you very rarely see on the same page, all very strongly supporting this decision to move forward, whether it's app providers on the edge of the networks, rural broadband providers, other advocacy groups. It's been really nice to see. Thanks.
All right, we'll take questions on the wireless infrastructure item. Todd?
Hi. Roughly speaking, wireless infrastructure, more broadly a race to 5G, as it were. For either or both of you, where is the U.S. in this race? Who's our rival? Is it China? And are the forthcoming auctions announced in Barcelona for 28 megahertz and 24 and 28 gigahertz, are those the only auctions ahead for 5G? Because I know Commissioner Rosenworcel said we need auctions. So, in general, where are we, and will those auctions catch us up?
On the spectrum side, we have been in great position. We were the first country in the world to open up millimeter wave spectrum to allocate them for flexible 5G uses, and the chairman, with his announcement in Barcelona, puts us on the path to auctioning some of that spectrum this year. So the spectrum side, we've been pushing very aggressively. I think the one area where we've had a potential hurdle is on the infrastructure deployment side, putting that spectrum to use. Again, these networks are going to look very different than 4G. The economics that worked for 4G, the review procedures that worked, aren't going to work for 5G given the densified networks and the small footprint. So with this decision, I think we are, again, putting ourselves forward to take the lead on this. To your point, Europe is looking to move aggressively, China, South Korea. As I've traveled around the world, I've been to Buenos Aires, to Brussels. Everyone is very conscious that the U.S. led the world in 4G, and they're looking to leapfrog us to 5G. And one of their specific published paths to doing that is to clearing the path to this new infrastructure. And so it was very key that we moved quickly to take similar action to facilitate deployment. So I think this is going to set us up very well.
I would agree completely with how Commissioner Carr cast our efforts with respect to spectrum and infrastructure, and I would simply add this. The two of them go together. You cannot have 5G spectrum policy and expect to win in 5G solely on that basis. You also have to have forward-thinking infrastructure policies, and that was one of the things that became clear in my conversations with some of my counterparts in Barcelona. They are keenly aware that the FCC is leading not just in 5G spectrum policy, following my announcement of the 28 and 24 gigahertz auctions coming later this year, but also that we are being aggressive because we recognize that the networks of the future are going to be fundamentally different. And considering that this is a global race, this is not simply an area where we can labor in a vacuum and just expect to reclaim global leadership. We have to be aggressive here. They see, as do we with our action today, that the infrastructure policies need to be forward-focused. As I put it in my statement, you can have the regulatory status quo or you can have 5G. You cannot have both. There's just no two ways about it. And that's why I'm glad that the FCC acted decisively today to recognize reality and to embrace the 5G future.
Okay, on the infrastructure part, Commissioners Clyburn and Rosenworcel both called for a delay. Do you think a delay could have helped the Commission get to consensus on this item?
As I mentioned, we have been working on this issue for a period of 3 years now, dating back to 2016. Before I became a commissioner, certainly before I was given leadership of this issue, Chairman Pai made some significant decisions about how the process was going to run here. This was an unprecedented, in my view, consultation and level of engagement. It's one that I hadn't seen before. Again, I mentioned in my statement the number of states we went to, the number of tribal communities we were able to talk to. The chairman himself deserves a lot of credit for making that decision early on, and for him personally traveling and attending a lot of these consultations. And as I mentioned as well, the item benefited significantly from those contributions. So again, I think what we heard today was a lot of discussion about the process that was used. I welcome that. I think we need to use good process. I think when you look at actually what we went through in this decision, we really did go above and beyond the process that was required, and we saw some really good results because of that. So again, I don't think waiting another couple months before we take this effort would have produced a better outcome, particularly for those communities that we travel to, whether it's the Shenandoah Valley or East Baltimore, that right now don't have broadband. And as soon as this decision goes into effect, it's going to free up capital that can go to close that divide. So I don't think we should wait any longer for that.
Hi. Commissioner O'Reilly mentioned that this was a bipartisan effort that was started to be undertaken under Chairman Wheeler, former Chairman Wheeler, and folks are talking about 5G more in a national security context. But there are concerns from Wheeler and others that, it's important to get there fast, but also to make sure that cybersecurity concerns are incorporated into the standard. How do you address those concerns?
Speaking for herself, what I can say is that we have tasked the CISRIC with looking at this issue. They are actively considering this issue. In addition to that, we continue to work with our counterparts at other agencies. Under the federal law that exists, the Department of Homeland Security has lead responsibility with respect to the security of networks. And so we are working with them. In addition to that, I take classified briefings as is appropriate on some of the issues that we can't discuss in an open session. And so that is an issue that we are always on top of.
Yeah, I think the point that you're making is exactly right. When it comes to 5G, when it comes to cybersecurity, we need to be making sure that we're taking all the right steps. And if you step back, whether it's the private sector that is engaging in a number of efforts and work streams on this, or in government that are taking a lot of action as well, this is at the forefront of a lot of thinking as we look both to 5G and whether it's the Internet of Things as well, to make sure that we have safe and secure networks. I think we're heading in the right direction on that.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll go ahead and go back through the line. Todd, do you have a question?
Sure. Well, what happens with the VDAC and town and city oversight of small cells?
Sorry, what was the last part of that?
VDAC and town and city oversight. What are the next steps that you can anticipate?
Well, the BDAC's work continues. They'll be meeting in, I believe, a month or two. I can't remember the specific date. But their work continues across all of the different vectors that we task them with. The working groups are looking at a variety of issues, timely and cheap access to utility poles, model code, and the like. And so their work is going to continue, and we expect to be able to take their recommendations and execute on them as appropriate.
Perhaps this year?
I don't have a specific time frame because we don't know exactly what the output is going to be of the various working groups.
Margaret?
Okay, this is not 5G related, but it's on Lifeline and your reforms. There's been a lot of opposition to them, particularly on the proposal to eliminate funding for wireless resellers. And that opposition has come from public interest groups, telecom associations, and even some right-leaning groups like AEI. So given the feedback, do you still support that proposal?
Well, we're still in the process of evaluating the feedback that we got from once the record closed. And so we, in due course, will make the appropriate decision based on the facts that have been gathered and the input from entities like the ones you mentioned.
Okay, so you can't say right now if you're still for it.
Oh, well, I mean, we're still in the process of, we voted for the proposal, obviously. So now we're in the stage of evaluating the feedback on that proposal. So, yeah.
So getting back to the tension between, getting there fast and making sure that security, that that the standard is informed about cybersecurity. Since you mentioned the CISRIC and their work, there are concerns there as well that moving the timeline for the report making recommendations on security, that moving it up several months will affect the quality of the report and the recommendations that body is able to make. Is there a concern that they're going to be able to make substantial recommendations?
In our mind, there's not. We, as Commissioner Carr pointed out, need to take action soon to ensure U.S. leadership on 5G in terms of modernized infrastructure policies. Modernizing those policies in no way detracts from the mission of CISRIC or the overall importance of the issue of security. We continue to, as I said, to monitor the issue, to have CISRIC study it, to work in collaboration with our sister agencies on it. And so you can walk and chew gum at the same time, so to speak. We can move forward with modernized infrastructure policies and make sure we recognize the importance of cybersecurity.
It's quick follow-up. What prompted moving the timeline for that report up?
I can't say at this time what specifically motivated us. In terms of the...
So it was originally due March next year, and now it's due in September. What prompted, pushing it so far up?
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that. Well, I can't remember specifically off the top of my head. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rhodes.
At this point, I'll invite my colleague Mark up for the Bureau press conference.
So we'll combine the two wireless items, the infrastructure and signal booster. So if the teams want to both come up for that, or if there's questions on them.
I don't have one.
Question on either, Todd? All right, wireless is off the hook. Any questions on robocalls? Okay. 911? No? Okay. Public safety 4.9?
No.
Okay. Satellite stations? That's it. Thank you, everybody. Okay.